The church bells sounded like iron cracking in winter, each toll scattering crows into a white sky that did not care who was being given away. I remember how the snow lay over Gravel Creek like a burial sheet, and how Mercy Caldwell walked across it in boots too large for her breath trembling into the cold, as though her soul had already begun to leave her body. 19 is an age meant for wildflowers and river laughter, yet she moved toward the altar with the stillness of someone counting steps to a place she had not chosen. The townsfolk watched with the careful cruelty of people who believe themselves innocent. Women pressed gloved fingers to their lips and whispered that debt makes daughters light enough to trade, and men nodded as though they were discussing cattle weight rather than a human life. Mercy did not cry. She had learned early that tears only feed an audience. Her eyes remained lowered, fixed on the warped planks beneath her feet, memorizing every nail head, as if the floor might one day testify that she had once stood there unwilling. Elias Boone waited near the pulpit, had clutched to his chest, shoulders squared with a kind of respectful distance that looked, to those who did not know him, like indifference. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, pale as frostbite, and it was that mark more than any deed that had given the town its stories. They said he was a man who had buried his softness in the same unmarked ground where he buried his past. They said many things, because saying is easier than seeing. When Mercy reached him, he did not reach back. The preacher's voice rose and fell like a tired wind through dry grass, and the vows were spoken into air that felt already forgotten. Mercy's hands remained clasped in front of her, fingers knotted tight enough to blanch. When the ring slid onto her skin, she did not look at it. She looked instead at the window, where snow struck the glass in frantic, silent bursts, as though the world outside wished to intervene and could not. By nightfall the storm had grown teeth. The small ranch house Elias brought her to stood alone beneath a sky that pressed low and heavy, its windows glowing faintly like eyes that had seen too much. Mercy paused at the threshold, waiting for some claim to be made, some hand to guide or command. None came. Elias opened the door, stepped aside, and allowed her to enter first, as one might do for a guest whose stay is uncertain. Inside, the air smelled of pine smoke and iron. A fire had already been lit, though Mercy had not seen him prepare it. On the table rested a plate of bread and a tin cup of water. No words accompanied these offerings. Elias moved with deliberate quiet, setting his hat upon a hook, removing his gloves, placing them beside the door in a careful pair. He did not look at her for long, and when he did, it was with the wary gentleness one uses with a skittish animal. "I'll be in the barn," he said at last, his voice low enough to avoid startling the silence. The door closed behind him before she could answer, though she had no answer to give. That first night Mercy sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the storm gnaw at the walls. The ring felt foreign on her finger, a cold circle that belonged to someone else. She expected footsteps returning, a shadow crossing the threshold, some inevitable claiming of what the town believed had been purchased. Instead, there was only the distant sound of hooves shifting in straw and the muffled rhythm of wind against wood. She lay down fully clothed and slept without dreaming, because dreams require a future. Morning arrived as a gray whisper. Mercy woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the sight of chopped wood stacked neatly beside the hearth. A bucket of water stood by the stove, its surface still. The bread had been replaced with a small pot of oats, steam rising in gentle curls. Elias was nowhere in the house. Through the window, she saw him crossing the yard, shoulders dusted with snow, moving toward the barn with a bundle of hay under one arm. He did not look back. Days unfolded in this quiet pattern. Each morning something had been prepared before she woke. Kindling gathered, water drawn, a path cleared through the snow to the well. Each evening the barn light glowed long after the house had fallen into darkness. They passed one another like respectful ghosts, their lives intersecting only in the evidence of labor left behind. Mercy did not know how to interpret kindness that asked for nothing. It unsettled her more than harshness would have, for harshness is a language she understood. She found herself searching for proof of ownership, for some sign that the gentleness was merely a prelude to demand. When she found none, she grew restless, pacing the narrow rooms, touching the objects that had been placed for her use. A folded blanket, a bar of soap wrapped in cloth, a pair of gloves that fit her hands as though measured. The town did not let her forget what it believed her to be. When she ventured to the general store, the bell above the door rang with a brightness that felt accusatory. Conversations thinned and broke apart as she entered. The shopkeeper weighed flour with exaggerated slowness, his eyes sliding toward the ring on her finger and away again. A woman coughed into her sleeve and murmured something about purchased brides. Mercy paid with coins that felt heavier than their worth, and left before the air could close around her. Elias did not ask where she had been. That night she found extra money tucked into her sewing tin, placed there without comment. The gesture angered her, because it seemed to assume her need, while refusing her voice. She wanted, absurdly, for him to argue, to claim authority so that she might at least push against it. Instead, there was only that steady, infuriating respect. The storm deepened, sealing the ranch in a world of white and blue shadow. One afternoon, Mercy stepped into the barn to escape the suffocating quiet of the house. The smell of hay and animal warmth wrapped around her like a forgotten memory. Elias stood beside a lame horse, his large hands moving with slow precision as he wrapped the animal's leg. He spoke to it under his breath, words too soft to carry meaning, yet full of a tenderness that seemed at odds with the man the town had described. He noticed her only when she began to shiver. Without approaching, he lifted his coat from a peg and held it out, arm extended just far enough that she could take it without their bodies touching. The coat was heavy and smelled faintly of smoke and leather. Mercy hesitated, then accepted it, the weight settling around her shoulders like an unfamiliar promise. "Thank you," she said, the first word she had spoken to him since the vows. He nodded once, eyes lowered, and returned to the horse as though the exchange required no further acknowledgement. That night Mercy mended a tear in his shirt while he slept in the barn, her needle moving in careful silence. She did not know why she did it, only that the act felt necessary, a small balancing of an unseen scale. When she placed the folded shirt on the table before dawn, she felt a strange, fragile warmth, as though she had written her name in a language he might someday learn to read. Food grew scarce as the storm lingered. They began to work in the same spaces, passing tools back and forth, their hands sometimes brushing in accidental contact that sent quick, startled currents through Mercy's chest. They spoke little, yet their movements developed a rhythm, a quiet cooperation that required no instruction. He chopped wood. She stacked it. She kneaded dough. He kept the fire steady. Their breath mingled in the cold air, rising together before dissolving. One evening, while sweeping beneath the bed, Mercy's broom struck something hard. She pulled out a small chest, its lid unlatched. Inside lay a folded document, the paper thick and official. She could not read more than her own name, written there in careful script, but she recognized the shape of a deed from her father's many failed dealings. Her hands trembled as she replaced it, unsure whether she had discovered a gift or a trap. Rumor reached her the next day at the well, carried on the wind of other women's voices. They spoke of Elias planning to send her away come spring, of land transfers and legal protections that sounded less like kindness and more like dismissal. Mercy returned to the house with the weight of that possibility pressing against her ribs. She did not ask him about the document. Questions require courage, and courage was something she was only beginning to remember. That night the storm extinguished the lamp, leaving the room lit only by the fire's uneven glow. Shadows climbed the walls, stretching and folding as the flames shifted. Mercy sat at one end of the table, Elias at the other, the distance between them filled with the sound of burning wood. He pushed a tin cup of coffee toward her, the metal scraping softly across the surface. "Thank you," she said again, the words steadier now. He met her gaze for a heartbeat longer than before, something unspoken passing between them like a fragile thread drawn tight. Outside, wolves called from the hills, their voices lonely and wild. Inside, the fire held, its warmth touching them both without distinction. Mercy wrapped her hands around the cup and felt, for the first time since the church bell had tolled, that she was not entirely alone in the winter. The silence between them no longer felt like a wall, but like a field waiting for spring, and though she did not yet trust the promise of it, she did not turn away. Dawn arrived the next morning in a pale blue hush. The storm spent, but the cold lingering like a question that refused to be answered. Mercy woke before the fire had fully died and found Elias already gone, his boots missing from beside the door, the path outside newly cleared. Something restless had taken root in her during the night, a quiet insistence that she step beyond the house that had sheltered and confined her in equal measure. She followed the narrow trail his shovel had carved through the snow, her breath rising in soft clouds, her gloved hands pressed together as though holding a fragile resolve. The land lay beyond a low ridge, where the wind moved differently, less like a blade and more like a long exhale. Mercy recognized the boundary from the deed she had hidden back beneath her bed, though she had not allowed herself to believe in its meaning. The river ran there in a thin, dark ribbon beneath ice, and beside it the snow had been disturbed, cleared in a wide rectangle where raw earth showed through. Stones had been set in a careful line, forming the shallow outline of a foundation. Elias stood within that shape, his coat dusted white, an axe resting against his shoulder. He turned when he heard her approach, surprise flickering across his face, before settling into that familiar guarded calm. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the bare cottonwoods, their branches clicking together like distant chimes. "You found it," he said at last. Mercy nodded, her gaze moving from the stones to his hands, cracked and reddened by cold. "This is mine," she said, the words uncertain on her tongue, as though she were testing a language she had never been permitted to speak. "It can be," he replied, "if you want it." The simplicity of the answer unsettled her more than any command might have. She stepped closer, the snow crunching beneath her boots, and the distance between them felt suddenly charged with all the unasked questions she had carried for weeks. "Why?" she asked. Elias lowered the axe and leaned it against one of the stones. "A cage ain't a marriage," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "Your pa owed a debt he couldn't pay. Folks in town would have taken more than money to settle it. I could sign papers quicker than they could talk. That's all this was meant to be." The words did not land as an explanation, so much as a rearranging of everything she had believed. Mercy felt the ground beneath her shift, not violently, but with the slow, undeniable movement of thawing earth. "You married me to set me free," she said, each syllable careful. "I married you so nobody else could claim you," he answered. "Freedom's yours to keep or leave." He did not step closer. He did not reach for her. He simply stood within the square of stones he had laid with his own hands, as though building something he had no right to enter. The town's voices followed Mercy back from the river that afternoon, carried in the glances that slid over her and the murmurs that ceased when she drew near. Harlan Pike spoke loudly about legal propriety while measuring nails, his words arranged to sound like civic concern and not personal affront. Mrs. Kincaid observed that land has a way of changing hands in ways that invite scrutiny. Mercy felt their judgments pressing against her skin like sleet, and for the first time, she did not lower her eyes to escape them. She walked past without pausing, her silence no longer an admission but a refusal. That evening she found Elias in the barn, his hands wrapped in cloth, where the skin had split along his palms. The sight of the makeshift bandages struck her with an unexpected force, revealing the cost of the foundation by the river more clearly than any document. He had sold 2 of his best cattle. She had overheard the figures in town without understanding their purpose. Now the absence of those animals stood in the empty stall behind him, a quiet testament to a sacrifice made without announcement. "You should have told me," she said, taking the cloth from his hands and guiding him toward a stool. He watched her as she unwound the strips, his expression unreadable, but his posture yielding. "Didn't do it for thanks," he replied. Mercy dipped a rag in warm water and cleaned the cuts, her touch careful, deliberate. The intimacy of the act felt different from any closeness she had known, because it was chosen rather than imposed. Their fingers brushed, lingered, and neither of them withdrew. The barn smelled of hay and smoke, and something newly alive between them, fragile as a spark. Word of the land spread faster than Mercy expected. By the next Sunday the church was full of voices, sharpened by curiosity and disapproval. Harlan Pike stood near the front, papers in hand, speaking of propriety and precedent. of signatures and transfers that required oversight. His tone carried the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Mercy felt Elias's presence beside her, not as a shield, but as a steady warmth that did not intrude upon her space. When Pike finished, the silence that followed was thick with expectation. Mercy stepped forward before she could reconsider, the floorboards echoing beneath her boots. "I was given a choice," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "And I chose to stay." The words surprised even her, because they had not existed until the moment she spoke them. She removed the ring from her finger and placed it on the table before the banker, the metal glinting in the dim light. "This doesn't bind me," she continued. "It reminds me I wasn't bound to begin with." A murmur moved through the room, like wind through dry grass. Elias did not speak. He did not reach for the ring. He simply watched her with an expression that held both relief and something deeper, something that asked without demanding. Harlan Pike began to object, his voice rising, but Elias stepped forward then, unfolding a second document. He placed it beside the ring, his hand flat upon the paper. "Partnership," he said, the word plain and unadorned. "Ranch and river both. Legal and witnessed." Sheriff Rourke nodded from the back of the room, his approval carrying more weight than any argument. The murmurs faded into a stunned quiet, the town confronted with a reality that did not fit its preferred narrative. Outside, the snow had begun to soften, the surface breaking into a fine crust that cracked beneath their steps as Mercy and Elias walked home. Neither spoke for a long time, yet the silence between them felt different, filled not with distance, but with the echo of what had been claimed in public and accepted in private. Days later, when the first beams were raised over the river foundation, the town came not out of charity, but out of something closer to shame. Hammers struck wood in a rhythm that sounded like penance, each blow an acknowledgement of what they had failed to see. Mercy worked beside Elias, lifting boards, holding nails, their movements aligned without instruction. When the final beam was set, they stood together beneath it, the frame of the house casting long shadows over the thawing ground. Elias wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving faint streaks of dirt, and stepped back as though to give her space to claim the structure alone. Mercy felt the gesture and understood it for what it was, an offering without expectation. She reached for his hand before he could retreat further, her fingers closing around his, with a certainty that surprised them both. "Stay," she said, not as a plea but as an invitation. He looked at her then with an openness she had never seen, the guarded distance dissolving like frost under sunlight. She placed the ring in his palm, closing his fingers over it before he could speak. "Now it means something," she added. The river moved beneath its thinning ice, carrying with it the last remnants of winter. Around them the frame of the house stood bare against the sky, a promise rather than a possession. Mercy felt the past loosening its hold, not erased, but integrated into a story she was finally choosing to tell. If you have ever been handed a life that felt like a sentence, remember that dignity often begins in silence and grows in the smallest acts of grace. What we are given without consent does not define what we become by choice. And if this story found a place in your own winter, stay with us, because some houses take longer to build, and some hearts take longer to thaw.